like a news story, a feature story still has to have impact. Readers or viewers still need to see themselves in the story. But a feature story allows the reader or viewer to feel something. It allows him or her to have an emotion. Certain types of feature stories can be the most practical. You find these in lifestyles sections of newspapers or in lifestyle segments on TV or on websites. They can be among the most practical things you can offer people. And so that is very valuable to people. That makes them care. You want a feature story to have impact. You want people to feel some sort of emotion. That's a good feature story. What makes a good feature story? Well, if you're the reporter, you want to be able to say, hey, this is really interesting, or envision yourself telling a friend or a spouse or partner, hey, this is a really interesting thing you should know about. That's a good feature story. They should still be important and interesting. If they weren't important or interesting, you wouldn't need a journalist to tell the story. So, like a news story, they're important and interesting, but unlike a news story, they can offer a style of writing that allows the reader to emote, and it allows the reporter to spend a little bit more time with the subject and provide a little more detail. Hard news leads are relatively easy, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Get them in the right order. There's your lead. A feature story allows more leeway, which is a good thing, but it also can make the lead a little bit more difficult to write. A good feature lead should hook the reader in and then unfold from there. Ultimately, every story, including a feature story, needs to have the basic information. This is often in a newsroom called the NUT graph, N-U-T-G-R-A-F. It's newspaper slang. Graph means paragraph. I have no idea what nut comes from, but the term is nut graph. So in a news story, the nut graph will be in the lead. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. In a feature story, that might not be in the lead, but it will have to be in the story somewhere. The story still has to answer those basic questions. There still has to be a reason to do the story. So a feature story is defined by how it's written, but it still conveys important or interesting information. A feature lead should offer a storytelling experience. What's interesting? What's compelling? What hooks the reader or viewer into the story? So one option is to start with an interesting anecdote and let the story develop from there. Another option is to use a single person who typifies the story. So you write about that person in the lead, and the story unfolds from there to reveal that the individual you wrote about is part of a larger trend. And it doesn't have to be an individual. You can cite a singular instance of something and then let the story unfold to reveal that it is part of a larger trend, and that's the story you're telling. In a feature story, it is very easy to fall into the trap of writing a cliche. Don't do it. It was a dark and stormy night. Once upon a time. These things were fine once. By the zillionth time they've been used, they will turn people off. And yes, I know that Quentin Tarantino just released a movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He was being ironic. So avoid cliches. You should avoid cliches all the time, but in feature stories, it is so easy to fall into that trap. Keep it in mind. The goal of a news story is to inform quickly. A feature story can spend more time with the subject. They still need to inform, but they can include more thorough descriptions. So they can include anecdotes and other detail that illustrate a point rather than just state it. What do I mean by illustrate a point? Well, here's a rule of thumb. Show, don't tell. Okay, that's worth repeating. Show, don't tell. Describe things that enable people to see what you see. That's showing. Here's an example. I'm recording this in South Florida. It's raining terribly today, so I could just say that. That's telling. I could show by saying the rain is coming down so hard that each time the drops hit windows, people jump. They get the jitters. I could state that people are worried that their pools are going to overflow, or that they're so worried their pools are going to overflow that they're constantly checking out the window to see if that's a problem. Those things show the problem with the weather. They don't just tell it. One problem with new writers is an overuse of adjectives. Now, adjectives are not verboten. You can use them, but be judicious. And the reason is that adjectives don't show, they tell. So a feature story can be more valuable and more enjoyable if you use descriptions rather than adjectives to get the point across. Even though you're writing a feature story, resist the temptation to be hyperbolic. I'll illustrate this point with an anecdote from history. Abraham Lincoln was extremely tall for a man of his era. I believe he was 6'4", which is tall even today, but it was certainly very tall back then. So people would often ask him how long a man's legs ought to be, and his response, long enough to reach the floor. So, how long should a feature story be? Long enough to tell the story. Not too long, not too short. Just because you have the space, if it's a printed story, or the time, if it's a broadcast story, doesn't mean you have to overwrite or overstate or be hyperbolic. Here's a tip. Before you sit down to write your story, create an outline. Now, an outline is very, very simple. It's just a very short list of the points you want to cover and in what order. When you have the outline and you go to write your story, you elaborate on each one of these points. Now, the way that you write the story will deviate from the outline as you get into it, and that's perfectly fine. What the outline does, it allows you to start the story. Think of going on a road trip. You're going to map it, and then when you're on the road, you might change the route you take for various reasons. But it allows you to get out the door and not be intimidated by the story itself. In Fort Lauderdale, where I was the editor of the newspaper, the Sun-Sentinel, there is no way that we would do a major investigative story without an outline. Now, some of these stories were 4,000 words, 5,000 words, many of them with sidebars. It was much easier to focus our thoughts if we had an outline from the get-go. Another tip. Questions that are likely to yield a yes or no response are not going to give you the kind of detail that you want for a good feature story. They're not going to give you the kind of quote that you want. Interviewing children, sometimes interviewing people who speak a foreign language can be difficult because they're likely to answer yes or no. So rephrase your question. Instead of asking yes or no questions, begin your question by asking, how did such and such occur? Or why did such and such occur? You can't answer those questions yes or no. So you're prompting your subject to elaborate and give you the detail that you want. A feature story isn't just puff. It isn't just flowery. You can be and should be more descriptive. You can write in a more colorful way than you would in a news story, but ultimately there still must be a point, and you need to make that point. So don't meander, don't overwrite, make your point.